Hello, Grd11s. Welcome to the next part of ecology. We're going to deal with water pollution, or just water in general, and water in ecology. So if you ever say you don't know what some of the most important parts of ecology are, you're going to be lying. All right, so I really hope that this is going well for you. All right, so in this section, we're going to be looking at availability and the quality of the water. Both of those are extremely important, and then we're going to look at availability and a bit more. We're going to do availability first, and then we'll do quality afterwards, and both kind of go hand in hand, because like how much you have and how good of how clean the water is extremely important to all living individuals, specifically humans. And we're going to learn about how humans have messed up certain water ecosystems for their own benefit, and how that has caused loss in biodiversity and all those other wonderful bits and pieces. Okay, so let's just talk about how much water we actually have and where the water goes. So South Africa's rainfall is about 450 mils per annum, okay, so per year, and this is over the whole of South Africa. So please don't think that everywhere rains about 450 mils. It really only is this is over the entire thing, because some areas are drier and some areas are warmer. Okay, but that is half of most of the countries in the world. So 77% of our water comes from the surface water, so rivers, lakes, and dams, 9% from groundwater, and 14% from reused water. Okay, so majority of what we use is on the surface, and we need to find a way of actually trying to reduce how much water we've lost. And certain parts of the world have become quite smart in how they do it. So one particular part of the world has actually dropped these black balls over the entire part of body of water to actually absorb all the UV radiation and not actually heat up the water itself, so that it doesn't evaporate. And remember that water itself is a greenhouse gas. So if we have too much evaporation, sure, we're going to have more rain, but it also could increase the amount of greenhouse gases that we expect to find in our country. Okay, so water availability spans over a whole bunch of different bits and pieces. So let's have a look. We're going to deal with construction of dams, destruction of wetlands, poor farming practices, droughts and floods, exotic plantations and depletion of water table, boreholes and effects of aquifers. That's not too important. The aquifers is not too important, but the boreholes are. We're looking at wastage, and I think that's about it. No, last one, cost of water. Because so we're going to be doing two of these at a time. So we're going to be looking at construction of dams and destruction of wetlands first, then poor farming practices, droughts and floods, and how they are very closely interlinked, exotic plantations and depletion of the water table. Certain plants should not grow in South Africa because we do have a lot of water in South Africa in some certain places. And if you plant plants that use more water than our natural indigenous plants, it's actually going to seal water away. We're going to look at boreholes and how we can use them to increase availability of water in our homes and also for large environments, so that we don't abuse too much of it. We can look at how we waste it, and finally the cost, which sounds a bit like something we shouldn't cover, but it is quite important. So let's look at the construction of dams. So in South Africa, we get our water mainly from rivers, dams, and underground water supplies. About half of our annual rainfall is stored in dams, which is insane. Imagine all the water within a year, and half of that is just in a dam. And remember that dams are generally connected together by rivers as well. So dams are built to solve four main purposes: to supply water for households, commerce, and industry, to supply water for irrigation, for controlling floodwaters, and to store and generate hydroelectric power. Okay, so I need you to know a minimum of two of these, please. You need to know 50% of this. Pick one, and the supply of water for two different things is actually quite important. We'll also talk about how, in the section of work, how households, commerce, and industry is bad, but how we use our water, sometimes we can reuse it. Whereas for irrigation, how we can actually cause eutrophication, which, if you remember from grade 10, is the development of that entire layer of algae on top of water, which causes the death and destruction of many plants and animals, specifically fish. Okay, controlling floodwaters, because if we have large amounts of land which are able to hold large amounts of water, it means that a lot of it will not hit urban or rural areas where a lot of people stay, even though a lot of those rural areas and urban areas are directly on the walls of the dam. And then finally, we'll talk about hydroelectric power. As much as it is kind of a thing in South Africa, it's not as much of a thing, and mainly overseas. So Disadvantages of constructing a dam, because you can imagine now that holding all of this water and not allowing it to flow naturally can actually have some negative impacts on the environment, specifically if the water is not able to be moved at regular intervals, and if it just stays stagnant, we can obviously have a whole lot of insects such as like mosquitoes that can actually grow on top of it. So there are a lot of disadvantages. So let's have a look. So people and their livelihoods are affected because they might rely on natural water sources, specifically farming. A lot of dams, and specifically the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, which I'll bring up a little bit later, has really affected a lot of livelihoods because as people relied on natural flooding once a year or twice a year, and now all of a sudden it's not occurring. So the natural balance of the river is upset. Remember that there might be very specific spawning areas for fish, frogs, and salamanders, and now all of a sudden that water is no longer in high amounts, which causes them to not be able to breed properly and causes loss of biodiversity. Dams increase the amount of water lost by evaporation, because they have large surface areas from which the water can evaporate. So if it's almost like having a bottle that only the top is open and only that can evaporate, versus if you cut the top off the bottle and you just allow all the water to kind of escape as it feels fit. The amount of evaporation is absolutely insane, which means that we're ultimately going to lose a lot of that water that we have put in a dam. So as useful as a dam is to hold our water, we're also going to lose a lot of it. Also remember that people start to put things called effluents, okay? So they might start dumping all of their waste, both bodily fluid waste as well as, just solid waste into the water because it hides it. I mean, if I was smart enough and I killed someone, I'd probably put it in a dam as well. So, there's a lot of stuff inside of there. And then, we use a lot of it for recreational uses like boating and skiing and all those kinds of things. And, those boats are actually adding a lot of carbon dioxide or carbon particles into the water itself, which is causing the environment to change quite rapidly. So as good as a dam is, it's also extremely bad, and it's very expensive, and people like to steal money from people who create dams as well. All right, let's have a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of having a dam. So we're going to start at the bottom right-hand corner. So we can have a regular, we can get food from irrigation. So we can have a very regular set of or amount of water that is released from the dam itself and then is moved onto agricultural lands, which means that we're going to have more sustainable amount of water, but at what loss from whatever's going down the road. But however, we're going to have an increase in salinity, which means an increase in salt. So if you poured a lot of salt onto the ground and you let it soak in, it would actually bind to the particles of the soil and cause it to become extremely stiff and rigid, and you can't break through it, and this will lead to waterlogging. Then we're going to have displacement of people. So all those rural communities that were living in areas very close to a river now all of a sudden experience flooding. And when those lands flood, it means that they're going to lose a lot of space. So those people need to be moved, and a lot of the time they don't get compensation for moving as well. Then we got recreation, which I was talking about, boating and fishing and all those other wonderful bits and pieces, which also can damage. Then we have the greenhouse gas emissions from flooded vegetation. Remember, we spoke about methane earlier and how that is going to increase the amount of gas, and that is 23 times more dangerous than carbon dioxide. We're going to have sedimentation. So now this is more of a geography thing, but it's important to understand this. All the small particles of sand that have been brought from upstream, maybe from mountains and stuff, those really fine particles have been moved into the dam. Now naturally what would happen is the sediment is moved through the river, and then it is eventually deposited near the end of a very large mouth openings, maybe in like the ocean or a natural like lake/dam. Okay, we don't have lakes in South Africa, but we have natural dams sometimes. A lot of them are man-made though. And if you keep on increasing the amount of sediment at the base of the basin of the dam, it's going to increase the level and actually cause flooding. Okay, but we are going to have a very constant water supply that will be taken to, as you can see on the side over there, taken to urban and rural communities. Maybe not all rural communities, but hopefully some. Energy options. What we do is a lot of the time we use water to cool down a lot of what are those things called? Turbines. and power chutes that actually release a lot of heat, so that we can actually produce more energy quicker. However, though, once we've used that water, we can't reuse it back in that industry, so it is being pumped back into our rivers and dams with a whole bunch of nutrients that can actually cause a lot more damage than good. Then we have environmental flow requirements. So even though we want to create a dam, it means that we still need to release certain amount of water down the river path. Otherwise, a lot of individuals, trees, animals, and insects are actually going to die. And to a large extent, people who live in rural communities who cannot afford to go into town and actually buy food, and they're farming, and now all of a sudden they don't have access to that water flow. So to a large extent, it needs to be regulated extremely well. Then we have the hydroelectric power, which means we're creating an alternative source of energy, but at what cost? And a lot of the time, hydropower or hydroelectric power is not as beneficial or as useful as we'd like it to be. So it doesn't produce enough electricity to actually run a lot of part of the world. And also building the turbines for hydroelectric power, extremely expensive. And then next to it, we need to maintain it. Okay, so once we've built all of this stuff, someone actually needs to put money in to make sure that all of this continues. Then we have licensing issues. So like, who is allowed to use this water and who is not allowed to use this water? So, human beings are under this idea that water is something that they can just dam up and start selling. So the idea about this entire thing is, okay, I'm going to seal a whole bunch of water. I'm going to create a dam, but then you need to pay me because I have access to this water. Even though it shouldn't be like that and it should be completely natural. Unfortunately, that is how it works. So we're going to have loss of livelihoods from fisheries because now all of a sudden there's not enough water for the fish to actually survive in. And that is going to cause people to just not actually have food as well as have access to selling, basic amenities. Transboundary water competition, because now, like, let's say a river runs from Gauteng to Free State, who has access to their water? And where am I allowed to dam that water up, which is going to stop it from moving from one province to the other province? Does one say, okay, we're going to share the water because it runs through both provinces, or, how do we actually function it around? All right, so it's really not a problem. And then also we have riverbank erosion, which means that a lot of the rivers are going to become a lot wider, which is going to change the amount of water flow per meter or per second, so on and so forth. And that is going to affect the livelihoods of a lot of living organisms in that area. Okay, so let's look at destruction of wetlands. The destruction of wetlands. So what is a wetland by definition? A wetland is an area in which the soil is wet long enough for the air that is found between the soil particles to be replaced by water. So it is waterlogged. Okay, the soil becomes waterlogged and water collects on the surface of the soil, which means that it creates its own natural dam, if you will. But these wetlands are a lot smaller. And if you don't really know what a wetland looks like, I want you to think about that pond just before you turn right to go to Grace Trinity, on the right hand side with all the reeds. Reeds are a big indication that there is a wetland. Also, majority of the Reed Fillet Zoo farm is a wetland itself as well. So that is why there is a big problem when Tin Cup was actually built, because it was built directly next to a wetland, and that was going to affect the natural species that were in there. So it became quite a big hoo-ha, but just so you guys have an understanding. Also, if any of you have been to the Johannesburg Zoo, you'll notice by the flamingos on the right hand side that there is an entire wetland. And what that wetland does is all of its natural, like all the water that is used for cleaning and or for toilets, is passed through that wetland. And the reeds themselves have this sort of jacket, this jelly jacket around the roots, and that jelly jacket is actually able to absorb a lot of all the what we would say is like dangerous or dirty particles, and it gets absorbed into the plant. The plant can then be harvested and or be used for building structures or food for certain animals, and then they can be replanted. So for we can use wetlands to our advantage, even though we like to destroy them. So there are three different examples: swamps, marshes, and bogs. What I don't expect you to learn the definition of all three of these. I just want you to be aware of them. So let's have a look at pictures. So the definition of a swamp is a seasonally flooded land with more woody plants than a marsh and better drainage than a bog. Okay, so they occasionally flood, and then when they flood, certain animals, like aquatic animals, come in there and they use it as a nursery for all their young to actually develop and grow. Then we have marshes, not a marsh, sorry. Marsh is an area of soft, wet, low-lying land characterized by grassy vegetation and often forming a transition zone between water and land. So what is a transition zone? It is an area where you can't indicate where it is water and where it is land. It is the independent, or the mixture of the two of them, okay? And that is what a marsh is. You can see some pictures over there. It's quite recognizable. Then we have bogs, okay? I don't really think we get a lot of these bogs in South Africa, but they do occur. An area having a wet, spongy, acidic substrate, okay? So the ground is very wet and spongy and acidic, composed chiefly of sphagnum, moss, and peat, which is characterized shrubs and herbs, and sometimes trees usually grow, okay? So bogs receive the most of their water from precipitation, which is rain, rather than runoff or flood waters. Okay, so what are the benefits of a wetland? And these, I expect you to know at least 3 of these, because it's quite important. So it filters sediments, pollutants, and nutrients, which I mentioned earlier, from urban areas and or rural areas. Sponge-like quality allows water to be returned to the ground during dry periods. Okay, so there is a water table. So there's water in the ground itself, and that water is actually able to rise up to the surface if it becomes quite dry. It provides open space and enhances property values. So for instance, in the nature estate and the eco estate, there are natural water wetlands, and they refuse to actually touch them, and they're not allowed to by law. And because people are not allowed to touch them by law and damage them, being closer to one means that you have more free space. And if you have more free space, it means you have more money. So it helps slow water from and preventing floods. Remember that it is waterlogged, and so that all the water can be captured inside of there, but it's also creating a lot of has a lot of reeds, which is stopping water from rushing past it. Finally, it supports diverse wildlife. Oh gosh, there's so many, like birds, odd birds that grow in those reeds and stuff like that. Okay, so wetlands serve many purposes. 3 main ones: for agricultural use, for water. Vegetation of the wetland purifies the water, which we've spoken about a couple of times. The wetland helps to decrease the chance of flooding downstream the wetland. And those are all really important, because if you do not have a legitimate structure, it means that your lands will probably cope a bit. Finally, wetlands are destroyed often by people because they don't know any better, by draining the water, okay, so using it for agriculture or something like that, and not used properly, filling it with soil because you want to grow a build on top of it, clearing its plants because you want to see the beautiful water, even though those plants are producing a lot of food and nutrients for the birds as well as fish. And also like little houses itself for any developing organisms inside of them. And we do all of this in order to build roads, factories, houses, shopping malls, or parking garages. Okay, so this reduces the availability and the quality of water, because it is both a filter as well as a area where a lot of things can live. All right, so next time we will continue with some water, and I'll see you guys soon. Cheers.